Welcome to the Seeker to Seeker podcast. I'm your host Simeon, and I bring you conversations on the spiritual journey with some of the most experienced seekers. For writing on spirituality, make sure to check out the Seeker to Seeker blog, linked in the description below. Please consider helping the Seeker to Seeker project grow by subscribing to the channel and signing up for the blog's newsletter. It really helps a lot. Today's guest is Dr. Leanne Domash. Leanne is a psychologist and psychoanalyst whose interdisciplinary work is deeply rooted in dreams and the imagination. We met over Zoom on the occasion of Leanne's brand new book coming out now, titled Imagination, Creativity and Spirituality in Psychotherapy. Welcome to Wonderland. As you can guess from the title, Leanne's new book explores a wide range of topics, but at its core, really, it is a book about the human spirit and its power to create, transform, heal, and grow. In our conversation, Leanne and I discussed the different ways creativity manifests, not only in the human spirit, but in nature as well. We talk about the accumulation of scientific evidence for certain abilities of the human mind, which we still call paranormal for a lack of a better word. It was interesting to learn just how much of these uncanny abilities psychotherapists encounter in the course of their practice. Leanne and I also discussed the power of art and culture to heal the spirit and help it navigate life. And we talk about how and why people produce meaning and what meaning's role is in our lives. We had a wonderful conversation together, and I'm happy to be sharing it with you now. If you wish to follow Leanne's work or check out her new book, you'll find some useful links in the description below. Now, without any further ado, here is Dr. Leanne Domash. Enjoy. You have struggled to find the topic, the core of the book, even though you had these many ideas floating around. And even in the end, in the title, it's you have imagination, creativity, and spirituality. But even though it seems like it's three things, I think in the book, it turns out that it's one thing really, that we just give different names because it finds different expressions in different areas of life, I suppose. Mm-hmm. So can you tell me, in your view, what's the link between imagination, creativity, and spirituality?
Well, they're all forms of imagination, and I discuss in the beginning the spiritual imagination. Then I discuss the relational imagination, which would be between people. Then I discuss the aesthetic imagination, which is more creativity. I discuss the biological imagination because the body, down to the cellular level, is very creative. And I call that the adaptive imagination. And then there's, of course, the dream work imagination. So it's different types of imagination that I explore. Each chapter is devoted to a different type of imagination. And they can all be used to help us heal, work through problems, develop new ideas, and, live a more joyous life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And imagination, one thing that's very interesting, we spoke about ideas and where they come from. It's very interesting whenever somebody personally gets, comes up with a new idea, even if it's something small, even if it's the solution of a problem in a corporate setting, it most of the times, if not always, it doesn't feel like somebody has created the solution, but rather that it has come from somewhere, or that you have found it, that you have stumbled upon it. So it almost feels as if there's this landscape of ideas, and then you just stumble upon a good one. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Well, I'm not exactly sure what you mean, but what comes to my mind is, when I get an idea about a patient, it isn't like it's coming from me, my idea, but I hear, and I know this might sound crazy, I hear a voice inside my head that's telling me what to say. It's like that voice found an idea, and then I repeat it. So, and so it's almost like you could say it's coming from outside.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm hearing the voice, which is, I think, how poets have felt, that it's coming through them from an external force. Or you could say it's coming from my unconscious or up through my right brain, and it's formulated, and then I hear it.
Mm-hmm.
So whether it's from a landscape, as you said, or it's from a relaxed mind that can make greater and freer associations, so you can somehow put together something novel.
Mm-hmm.
Because the left brain is the logical. This is simplistic, but generally speaking, the logical side, the rational side, and this, our culture has elevated this, and in therapy we have to battle this, because we don't want people to be logical and rational. We want them to be really in touch with their feelings and get down to their early memories, and so you have to be very relaxed to do this, which is a whole nother subject about how you bring someone into that relaxed state so they can make those associations. Mm-hmm. But when I talk to a patient frequently, it feels like it's coming from somewhere else, and I'm just repeating it.
That's very, very interesting.
And it's eerie a little bit.
Yeah.
To me. But I listen to it and I say it. And it's much better than just listening to my logical voice.
And does this voice only come up during therapy, when you're conducting therapy, or does it come up in other times in your life?
I don't notice it so much other times as in therapy, because then I'm so focused. Mm-hmm. And then I'm listening to that voice. But I'm not that aware of it. I'm going to pay attention now that you brought it up, but I'm not that aware of it other times as in therapy.
That's very, very interesting. And you do this because I'm studying Buddhism, and this brings up many connections with the idea of mindfulness in Buddhism. Mm-hmm. And you do mention it in your book. But it's interesting how, as a layman, my understanding of therapy is that the patient goes there with some kind of issue they want to work on, and the therapist is there with some kind of knowledge, education, intuition, and tries to help the patient, and they just speak. But from your book, I know that there's a specific state you need to enter, and a certain atmosphere you need to create. And this I think relates very directly with Buddhist practice, with the idea of mindfulness and meditation. So in Buddhism, insight is seen as the fruit of meditation. So you sit down, you become concentrated, as you mentioned during practice, and then you seem to gain insight. But it's interesting because the insight you gain is not something you work out. It's something that is revealed once the chaos of ordinary thought kind of quiets down, and it's there. So that's very interesting, the parallels between those two practices.
Yeah. And I don't know if in Buddhism this is the case, but Jung had this concept of temenos, which is a sacred space. And the office becomes a sacred space, which triggers this state of meditation. So you try very hard to do that, so that almost they start to feel it as soon as they walk into the space. And then your attitude as a therapist encourages that state. And that's when the boundaries are lowered, as I guess in meditation, so that there can be more mingling of the two selves in the space, so you can really get a sense of what's going on with the patient. beyond the words, beyond even the nonverbal communication.
And Jung, there's a lot of, you can almost directly trace, I think, a line of succession probably from some early shamanistic society to Jung. You see a lot of this idea of the shaman who guides the soul, the initiate, and heals them. I think there's a direct parallel in the work of psychotherapists in creating that sacred space. So it's very interesting in that sense. Psychotherapy is a modern expression of that ancient practice.
Yeah, I think so. And yeah, and that's why I feel psychotherapy is a sacred act. And you want to establish what Martin Buber called the I-thou relationship, so that you listen very deeply to what the patient is saying, and the patient listens deeply to you, and you really get a sense of what's happening. And, you know, there was an apocryphal story told about Martin Buber. I don't know if it's true or not, but supposedly a young rabbinical student came in to talk to him, and he was very busy, and he was preparing a lecture, and he barely looked up, and he kind of just cursorily listened to the student. The student was very depressed. The student left and committed suicide. And he vowed then never to have that kind of relationship again, which he called an I-it relationship, where the person is just an object that he's listening to, but rather have an I-thou relationship, which is a sacred relationship and is an echo of the person's relationship with God. But this is in everyday life, to have an I-thou relationship.
And that sort of careful listening in dialogue and in therapy, but also I suppose even when one is on their own, that sort of opening up, I think it has a big presence in a lot of mystical schools and in the ideas of many mystical thinkers. For example, Meister Eckhart, he would love to say that as long as the more of you there is in yourself, the less of God there is in yourself. So the more you empty yourself of you, the more God is within you.
Wait, say that again?
So I'm probably misquoting him, but he says, the less and less there is of you in yourself, the more of God there is in yourself. So his formula basically is the more you can reduce the you, the more God can enter you. Or maybe it's not entering, maybe it's this idea of diffusion into God, which you talk about, which I suppose is in the Kabbalah. I'm not very, I don't know much about the Kabbalah, but I do find many connections between it and this idea of, what was the thinker? Was it Bion or Bion?
Bion, yeah.
Bion, yes. So kind of connecting to the O, which is kind of that wholeness. So
right, the Godhead, he might say, yeah. But you know, it's interesting. It depends what you mean by the you. If it's the you that is like narcissistic or exhibitionistic or selfish, yes, you reduce that. But the Kabbalah teaches that if you find your authentic self, which would be a self that repairs the world, that listens deeply, that's a sacred act. And that brings you closer to God. So they feel, and in that way, it's very similar to psychotherapy, in that psychotherapists are trying to help people find the true self, not the false self. The false self maybe would be what Eckhart is talking about. You have to reduce that. But I think the presumption is the true self is a godly self, and that's the divine spark in you. So if you can find that, you're close to God.
I think you're right. I think that's the way to interpret it. He would also love to say, God is closer to me than I am to myself. That's one of my favorite quotes of his.
That's
Yeah. So talking about spirituality, it's just always interesting. Whenever I would speak to a psychotherapist, I'm always very interested because as a psychotherapist, you get to speak with many people in a very intimate way. So you get to know people in a way that most of us would never. So with your experience, what would you say the role of spirituality is in people's lives nowadays when all our religious systems seem to fall apart, but at the same time, all of these smaller, kind of more personal belief systems spring up and everybody seems to have their own personal spirituality? It's very interesting, and I wanted to ask what your experience is.
People, I don't find that people talk that much about spirituality directly. A few people do, usually that they've lost their faith. And it's interesting that sometimes I practice meditation with patients for either a small part of the session or even the whole session because they want it and they crave it. And a few people have said that has begun to restore their faith. The thing is that I couldn't generalize about people, but I will say that without some kind of faith, and this doesn't have to be faith in God or faith in a religion, but without some kind of faith, I don't feel that you can heal. Mm-hmm. You have to have faith in, say, if you come to psychotherapy, you have to develop faith in the process, faith in the therapist, faith in yourself. Otherwise, you can't heal. So, of course, there are many people for whom this is very difficult. They're mistrustful, they're somewhat paranoid, they're distant, they're dissociated, they're detached. I would say all these people lack faith and therefore maybe don't have access to spirituality. And you have to bring them into some kind of experience of faith in order for them to benefit. It's, very similar to the placebo effect, which is underrated, and it's very important. It creates all kinds of brain changes that help you heal. And that's based on the faith you have in the physician who's giving you the drugs or the faith in the medication or whatever. And there have been various studies that show when new drugs come out, physicians lose faith in the older drugs, and then they start to become less effective because there's no enthusiasm on the doctor's part. And then there are all these wild studies. I mean, they did one study, I hope I'm remembering this correctly, where this was with Parkinson's disease, I think, where they actually performed a sham surgery on some people and did a real surgery on the others. And that meant they drilled holes in the skull in all the subjects, but some got the surgery and some didn't get the surgery. They didn't know, of course, which group they were in. And the ones who thought they got the surgery improved, and including riding bicycles around that they hadn't been able to use, that much mobility in years, and they had not gotten the surgery. So it's like the effect on the mind is like stupendous. So, and I think there was a lot of furor about that study because it was very invasive, and I don't think they're going to repeat something like that, but it demonstrated the profound effect of the placebo effect, which is very powerful, I think, in certain diseases. And Parkinson's is one, depression is another, pain, issues from pain, all these things respond to the placebo effect because it changes the brain.
Well, then it's very interesting how far this effect can reach, because this study would suggest or rather prove that what you believe in can literally shape the way your body functions.
Mm-hmm.
Then, of course, we know that there's not really any solid distinction, boundary between mind and body.
Mm-hmm.
And just so we know, there's no solid distinction between body and world. So in this sense, it's interesting to trace how much a person's faith or beliefs could affect the outside world.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's very important that the therapist inspire faith in the patient somehow. And you're not successful with every patient. And I'm a big believer that if you feel you're not connecting with the patient, you shouldn't see that patient, because that connection, which then leads to the faith, which then leads to the meditative state, is totally crucial.
Mm-hmm.
And you can tell right away, pretty much, if you're connecting or not.
Yeah. I wanted to, now that we're talking about spirituality, I was also reminded of there's a chapter in your book in which you discuss how art can heal us. And that's very interesting. I have a personal story about that as well. But first, I wanted to mention there's this great book. It's called Interpretation of Cultures. It's a great book of anthropology, which one of its key ideas, which struck me, was that the exploration of when culture emerged, and this whole idea of that we were primates and then we became proto-humans, then we became humans, and then we invented culture, is a fallacy, because as far as we can look back, culture has evolved and grown alongside humans. And the author made the claim and substantiated it that human beings have evolved in a symbiotic relationship with culture. So if you have a human being in a place where there is no art, there is no spirituality, there is no philosophy, that human being would not be able to cope with life. So that culture is an extension of our psyches, of ourselves. And so if we're not able to watch Romeo and Juliet, and if we're not able to listen to our favorite music, and if we're not able to connect with some idea of the divine, we would be crushed by life, or we wouldn't be able to cope with life.
Yeah.
What do you think about this?
I agree. But, it's interesting. It sort of reminds me of what I wrote about in the book about my reading Alice in Wonderland, because I kind of felt like my home was a little bit of a desert. But there was this one book that we didn't have that many books in the home, as I remember, but except for Alice in Wonderland was there. And I read it like, I don't know, maybe 100 times. And I was totally, totally fascinated by it. And it totally helped me. And it introduced me to dreams and all these fantastical figures that she met, and her courage and her problems. And it just opened up a whole new way of thinking to me. And, because school was more left-brained, I felt. It was like learning facts and learning how to write and learning how to read and learning history. All of that stuff is somewhat left-brained, but this was fantastical. And I feel like she was my first psychoanalyst, Alice, because she really helped me feel more, I don't know, she gave me hope that life could be very interesting.
Yeah.
So I think culture is incredibly important. And, as a result of taking the dream work course with Robert Bosnak, Embodied Imagination, I embarked on writing a series of plays, all of which were about trauma, had some element of trauma in them. And my idea was, in part, to play it, to produce them for audiences that had patients in them and therapists to help get new ideas about trauma and help patients work through some trauma using the aesthetic distance of the theater, of the theatrical presentation. And after each performance, we would have a talk back led by a drama therapist, and people opened up like unbelievably, embarrassingly so even, about their lives and about their families and about trauma and about everything, because they felt safe because the characters had expressed this, and it gave them the needed distance to think about their own lives. Yeah. So that's just one example of how art can heal.
Yeah, that's true. And now that you mention it, I remember examples in my life when I would be doing something or thinking something and not know whether it's right, whether it's correct, whether that's a proper way to live. And then I would see it in a movie or encounter a character in a novel that has that same behavior. And I'd be like, oh, right, that's a proper way to, that happens to people. And so it makes you feel much more real, which is interesting. Just encountering something that's within you in other people, even just characters, makes it, somehow validates it in a way.
Yeah. That's what I think happens in drama therapy. And another way books and legends can help is that they can inspire you, because like as a child, I would read about Eleanor Roosevelt and I so admired her and I wanted to be like her. I would read about Joan of Arc's courage and I would think, oh my God, you know, this is or Florence Nightingale, all of these like legendary creatures, not creatures, people. They didn't seem real to me because I didn't know them. I would just read about them, but they inspired me. So that's another way culture can help people evolve.
Yeah, that's true. And there's also one more way, which you touch upon, actually you discuss in detail. And now I want to share my story with you, which is actually about my mother, who in the past few years, in a matter of a few years, she passed through an excruciating period in her life. You know, sometimes each one of us has a soft spot, and you always hope that life wouldn't hit you there, but sometimes it does hit you just there. And so basically she lost a lot of kind of close people and went through a very tough period. And she at some point decided to try writing poetry, which you touch upon. And now I know that there's actually poetry therapy, a poetry-based therapy. And she started doing this. It was something that she had been doing in her early 20s, but then she abandoned. And then she started writing. She started attending poetry classes. And then from just a hobby, it became something that she became really invested in. And I could see how she, throughout time, with the development of her poetry style and her involvement with poetry, there would be changes in her attitude towards the kind of challenges that she has in life. And so I could see her recovering and adapting to the new circumstances. And no matter how hard it is, it certainly didn't solve her problems, but it definitely did help her overcome things that it didn't seem very likely she would overcome. So
wow, that's fantastic. So she did her own poetry therapy.
Yeah, apparently, without even knowing about it.
Not knowing about it.
Yeah, apparently there was something in it that made her feel that it's right for her and that it's good for her in some way. I don't think she's conscious of exactly how it helps her. And in your book, you mentioned that there's been studies that kind of look at that in more detail. But yeah, I can share. It almost seems like a cliche that somebody would reach out to art and poetry in tough times. But apparently, it's really profound. It really profoundly helps people, and it's very powerful. And I've seen that for myself.
Well, you know, you said she had it in her 20s. And I think that's true of many people. There's a talent there that life then takes over, and you have many other things to do and raise children, for example, etc. But then it's still there. So you come back to it later in life and you can use it. So people should remember what they loved doing when they were much younger. And I think it's wonderful that she reconnected with that talent she has.
Yeah. So
And I think it provides a lot of resilience, as well as it helps you focus in a different way. So you start to heal from your pain. Yeah. I think, a lot has to do with attention, what you're giving attention to. So if she's paying attention to the poetry now, she's gathering up that pain and giving it form. That helps a lot. That's really what a therapist does too, is they give form to the pain. They give a narrative to your story. And once you have a narrative, it's a lot easier to bear.
Yeah. Actually, I wanted to speak with you about this, the idea of narratives. I don't know if you've heard of the kind of ego, the 9 stages of ego development theory, how, we're born with egos that aren't very much differentiated from the world, and then they become more and more solid, and we become more and more individualistic. And then if our egos continue developing, they actually start to dissolve, and we lose that sense of separate selves. So,
by the way, I think that very much happens in life. I mean, maybe that's what you're saying, but I've noticed it myself. And I was just talking about this morning, that yes, I was much more left-brained earlier in life, and now, which is like getting a more and more differentiated ego. And then now in later life, I'm becoming less differentiated, more right-brained. And that does allow for more creativity too. So I think that's really true. But I think you have to be left-brained earlier in life, because you're building a career, you're devoting yourself to your family, you have to, really keep everything together.
Yeah. Which is interesting. Actually, also Jung remarked about it, that it's actually important to become solid in the first half of your life before dissolving.
Right. And that's the process of individuation. And then later you're more able to integrate the masculine and feminine parts, so that the female can, this is stereotypic, but I think it's more symbolic, can integrate, like taking care of the family. You have to be very self-sacrificing, but then you can integrate the other side, and the male can do the same. After being individualistic, can integrate the more giving side. But I don't look at it really that way. I look at it more that I, as a female, had to be very left-brained to, well, I guess professional women have to behave like men in a sense. We have that part. We have to do both, really, because we're raising a family and we're trying to be professional. So there's a lot of energy expended. And I don't think you have that much time to be more relaxed to create. And then later, when those jobs are somewhat done, they're never done, but they're somewhat done, you can be more open, more spiritual, more relaxed, and more creative.
Yeah. Well, I began talking about this idea of the ego development to kind of continue on the topic of narratives, because especially initially, as the ego is gaining solidity, it really depends on narratives a lot. It has to have the narrative that it follows, and it creates its own story about how things are, what it wants from life, what life is like. And then when the ego begins to dissolve, the more it sees the arbitrariness of narratives. and how you can have different stories about lives depending on where you're born, what gender you are, what circumstances you're in, what your temperament is like. So there's all this. The narrative is something. It's never absolute, and the more you become, the more you dissolve your ego, the more you let go of narratives. So, for example, even the Buddha would teach. He would say, "My teaching is the teaching of no teaching." It's just how things are without any stories about them, and that's why the ultimate state of Buddhism, the formless nirvana state, that there are no words, there is no story about what it is and what it's not. But so I wanted to ask you about this conflict that at least I see from where I stand between the fact that we do depend on narratives a lot because they do get us through difficult times, they do give us meaning. And at the same time, the more clearly we view reality, the more we see that narratives are something we create as crutches. And perhaps we develop an ability to let go of narratives and just be without any story and any desire to frame life. So, yeah, do you reconcile these two things?
Yeah, well, you're starting to sound like Beyond now, because he tells therapists to enter the session without memory or desire. You should not remember anything about the patient. You should not desire anything for the patient. You should just be with the patient. Which is it sounds like that's a very Buddhist concept.
Yeah.
Now, that's an ideal. And in that way, you eventually move towards move towards a state of being, which is just like an absolute. But I feel that everything is a balance. And I think that is very important, to not come to a session with preconceptions, even though you may have certain ideas about the patient. But on the other hand, you also have to, you do have to, at times, create a narrative for the patient so they can comprehend their life. From your point of view and the patient's point of view, you come to some kind of understanding for them. So I feel everything is a balance between narrative and being. And you have to know when to just be and when to intervene and create some kind of narrative. And it's an interesting paradox. I think the narrative gives you the stability for the patient, and the state of non-being invites change. So one of the themes in the book is the paradox, or the blend of stability and change. Mm-hmm. Like, you want the patient to change if they want to, you want to help them. On the other hand, they retain their basic core of personality. You don't totally change that. The same thing when a sperm and an egg are created. There's a lot of randomness in how an egg or a sperm can be created. And I found this very interesting and very symbolic of life itself, because when the chromosomes from each parent line up together, there's a split. But as they're lining up, a chromosome from the father can go over here, and a chromosome from the mother can go over here, and you can get an egg that has most of the father's chromosomes. And it turns out that at the moment of fertilization, there are like 64 million possibilities. So this is an amazing thing. And yet there is the stability because everything has come from one of the two parents. But there's stability and change. And that's how evolution proceeds. That's how psychotherapy proceeds. So I would say you need narrative and non-narrative to help a patient.
Interesting. So that's this classical idea of balancing order and chaos, yin and yang.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. Because in the non-being it's kind of chaos just to stay there. But then some order develops, and that's the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to have chaos too, or nothing new happens.
Yeah.
And you can't be afraid of the chaos. So I think it takes a long time to practice psychotherapy to accept that state of like just being, not knowing what's going on, not remembering about the patient and their history and what happened last session, and just listen for something to happen.
Yeah. Well, this brings us back to your book, in which you talk about biology and how it expresses creativity, and you also talk about artificial intelligence. It almost seems there's no topic you don't touch upon. But one particular topic that you do discuss, and I am very interested in, is these. So, for example, synchronicity, ESP, the way that subtle information is communicated between patient and therapist without any clear understanding of how it is communicated. So, for example, mentioning something the patient is thinking about without any logical explanation for how you could have known that. And it's very exciting when I get a professional to talk openly about these things, because I know that they're a very touchy subject and you can never talk too much about them, just because we know so little about them, and research into the area isn't stimulated.
Right.
It isn't encouraged. But it's very interesting. Previously, I had a guest, Dr. Diane Hennessy-Powell. She's from the Johns Hopkins Institute, and she works with autistic savant children, and and she explores and she documents the way that they apparently exhibit ESP abilities. So, and I found a very interesting parallel between something that Freud said and something that she has been led to believe from her work. So Freud, as you quoted him, believed that telepathy is something that must have been an inborn ability of people, which we've lost after which we lose after we begin to speak and use language and so on. And that in the beginning stages, a baby, is able to communicate with the mother in ways that we do not understand. And then Diane Hennessy-Powell, by studying savant children which have not developed their linguistic ability, even though they have grown up, so they're like 8 or 9 years old, but they cannot speak, they seem to have retained their ability to communicate.
Fascinating.
Yeah. So there was this very interesting story about a girl and her caretaker. Apparently, this ability to communicate in an unexplained way only works with people that these children are close with, either their parents or their caregivers. So in one of the experiments, they would put the child in one corner of the room and the caretaker in another, and they would give the caretaker a string of random digits, and they would ask the child to kind of spell them out. She would press buttons, and she would, without thinking, she would press the buttons with an over 90% accuracy, and sometimes she would press the wrong digit and say no, and then press the right one and correct herself, and that's without looking at the sheet of paper though. So it's really fascinating, and apparently research is coming up, but
there are a lot of studies about this, and I don't know I'm not capable of evaluating the design of the studies, but I have read the summaries of the studies, and there are many studies that do document this, and including the effect of a mind on machine. That this group of researchers at Princeton described this, where the person tries to get in sync with the machine, almost like you try to get in sync with the person, and it affected the random number generation. They were able to change the amount of X's and O's or whatever it was. They were able to affect the machine by their mind. So, I mean, this is not even two people. So, but they also demonstrated with people, including people who do not even know each other in different parts of the world. I mean, it's fascinating. And the thing is that someday we will understand this neurologically, just like we now understand mirror neurons and how that helps us understand the intentions of other people. And some say it helps explain empathy. We'll understand this ESP more. And Freud definitely believed in it.
Yeah.
But he didn't advertise that because he wanted his work to be accepted by the scientific community. Meanwhile, he egged his colleague and student Ferenczi to do all these experiments. And he kind of stayed in the background because Ferenczi was openly a believer in this. And talk about culture at the time of Freud's writing, as much as there was this scientific atmosphere, there was also a culture of this ESP. So that was very much, there were seances going on all the time and things like that. So both were in the atmosphere at that time. But I just found it so interesting to read some of his papers about ESP and what he reported. And he was a big believer.
Yeah. I'm going to run a very speculative idea by you now, which is just interesting. One of my previous guests, in fact, two of my previous guests, reported they were both kind of very, how can I say it, hardcore spiritual seekers, and they very much engaged with spiritual practice. And both of them report very extraordinary experiences in terms of ESP, so gaining access to information that they shouldn't normally be able to. So, for example, one of them would talk to me about just driving his car or sitting on a couch, just not really doing anything in particular, and he would get a flash of being somewhere else, being somebody else, doing something else. And it wouldn't be a vision, it would be an embodied experience of being somewhere else, doing something else. And both of them referred to a similar explanation, the same explanation really, which the way that they understand them, and of course I cannot attest to the truth behind their reports, but the way they explain it is that the more closely you are attuned to the now, which is what is happening right now, the more essentially their idea is this mystical notion. You have it in the Kabbalah as well, that God hasn't created the new universe, God creates the universe now and forever. And also Meister Eckhart would talk about how the universe wasn't created like 600 years ago, it's being created right now at this moment, and that God is now and it's here. And that's essentially what they would say, that all moments in time are connected, and because the now is now always. And the more you are immersed in the now, the more you can receive information from other times and other places, because they're all connected into this single point, which is always now. So this reminds me of, in your book, you report a number of instances where you would be just lost in reverie, and in your mind an image would pop up. And then you mention it to your patient, and they would be struck because it relates to them directly. And actually, Terry also mentioned a similar episode to me, in the way that an image popped into her mind. She spoke it out loud to the patient, and it led to a significant change in the way that therapy unfolded afterwards. Mm-hmm. So anyways, that's the idea. What is your experience with this, and what do you think about this?
Well, I love the idea that the universe is in the process of continual creation, and creation is now. And the idea of being in reverie, this is a very important concept that some writers have really, developed, like Antonio Ferro, an Italian psychoanalyst. He writes about reverie and the field, which is everything that happens between patient and therapist. Every comment the patient makes, even if it seems completely irrelevant, is part of the field. And the field can dream. And the whole session is a dream. And he's in a state of reverie. And I think from this state of reverie, it's again like Bion, something happens, something comes to you. And I don't know what to make of it, but this has happened to me, a number of times, where before a patient comes in, I'll be fixing the blinds, and just sort of just thinking, nothing special, just a momentary break between sessions. And something will come into my mind, phrases, everything. And then the patient will come in and say that. And I'm just like, I don't know what to do. It's like you were connected to them in the waiting room and they were thinking about it and it went into you, and then they say it. And so it's like, I don't know. I think, again, to me, an easy explanation is that you're in a very relaxed state. You're making associations that are new, but that still doesn't explain why you're thinking that particular thing from the patient. And I think I give an example in my book about, like, a patient was like very kind of, this is one thing that I find is very difficult. Patients sometimes talk in a very dissociated way to you, like they don't have feeling in their voice, and it seems like they're just reciting something from a book. And a patient was doing this, and I very much wanted to get him out of this, and like, how do you do it? And I just said, again, this came to me. It was one of those images that just came to me from somewhere else. And I just said, like, red check gingham apron, like in the middle of his lackluster monologue rather. And he just went like this, and he got teary. And he said that that's what his mother would wear, that kind of apron when she would make dinner. And she was very detached and didn't relate to him. And it kind of brought up this longing in him. Now, I don't know whether I just kind of associated to probably the era of his childhood and where he came from, or I really had an image of something. I don't know, but it doesn't really matter. It says two things. One is that sometimes you shouldn't be afraid to try something. And if you're wrong, you're wrong. As a therapist, I don't mean you should have wild analysis and just go nuts with saying things that are completely inappropriate, but I just felt this might be right. And secondly, the way you know you're right in what you said is if the patient then has more associations with more feeling. And that's what happened here. So whether or not I got it from an ESP thing, or I just kind of, it was logical, kind of thing. It doesn't matter, because it worked to help him. See, that's what I want in the therapy, for there to be this flow. And when there isn't the flow, something's wrong. Mm. And some patients are really challenges because they don't get into the flow very easily, which is the fault of our society so favors left brain thinking. And this is the whole point of Ian McGilchrist's book, The Master and His Emissary. It used to be the right brain was in charge and the left brain was just helping the right brain. And then all of a sudden, the left brain became the master. And it kind of rules us in ways, it's like a tyrant.
Yeah. There's this beautiful sentiment by Eckhart Tolle. He says, sure, your mind can solve crossword puzzles and invent the atomic bomb, but you don't need crossword puzzles. You don't need the atomic bomb. You just need to be happy. So, yeah. But I find it very fascinating how you speak about therapy. And just because, again, if we take a left brain kind of thinking, we would enumerate all the facts we know about psychotherapy, about psychology and neurobiology and so on. And then we could describe psychotherapy in very technical terms. And it leaves very little room for going outside the standard procedure. But when you use such, how can I say it, evocative terms and such symbolic language to talk about everything, it just allows for so much more possibility. And that's very interesting, I find it.
Yeah, well, this is another interesting thing, I think, that I tried to convey in the book, is that I think that the therapist can never be a poet, like your mother is a poet. The therapists are not poets, but they can try to kind of attempt to use poetic language with the patient, because that's more evocative, and sometimes even use words that are off kilter, that don't make complete sense. I do that sometimes, because this is what's necessary to shake the person up so they start to think of something new. And I very much believe in that. And whenever I can, I do that with the patient, because you try to be as evocative as possible. And the voice that comes to me helps me with that, because that's always an evocative voice that I hear, that I repeat to the patient. It's almost like I have like I'm on the radio and I have a producer who says, okay, now it's time to say this. And then I say it, but it's inside my head.
That's very interesting, really.
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't heard of that. And well, now this question, I suppose it's almost a cliche. Whenever you have psychotherapist friends, you always ask them, when you speak with so many people who have some sort of trauma, how don't you, how doesn't this affect you? But I think it's that's not just a question for psychotherapists. I think it's relevant to everyone, because whenever you create that kind of relationship with somebody where you kind of loosen your boundaries and you very intimately converse, you become very vulnerable. And especially because whenever, even if you're not psychotherapist, just a good friend or a good spouse or a child or mother or whatever, you try to really listen and you try to almost embody the other person's anxieties and problems. So my question to you is, how do you protect yourself from being harmed?
From being what?
From being harmed by the pain in the people you work with.
Well, first of all, sometimes you are harmed I am harmed temporarily. Like I will sometimes, there's this phenomenon again, which is scientists' question called projective identification, which where the patient is not only projecting onto you, like sees something in you that's really in themselves, like they say, oh, you're very greedy. I can tell you just want money from patients when they're greedy. This goes beyond that, and they try to make you feel greedy. They try to really evoke that feeling in you. Mm-hmm. Now, I think almost every therapist in existence knows this is the case, but yet, scientists, in fact, the discoverers of the mirror neurons say there is no such thing as projective identification because there is no scientific basis to explain it. But ironically, there was never a scientific basis to explain what mirror neurons do until they invented it, until they discovered it. So someday we'll understand projective identification better. But I give an example in the book of a little, I see children, and the 6-year-old was she was drawing pictures of witches and in a very sing-song way was talking about the witches, but again, with no feeling. And she was very frightened of her mother and her mother's anger. But she didn't say that to me or even show it in the play, but I started getting frightened of the mother. I started getting really frightened of the mother, like to a state of panic almost, whereas I thought she might in some way harm me or not like what I was doing, or I don't know. I just got very panicked. And then I had to talk to a colleague to understand that these were not my feelings. These were the little girl's feelings. So I was able to give it back to her in my mind and help her with the drawings and the witches with more feeling in me. I understood what she was going through. And then I met with the mother, and the mother was like so friendly to me, and it was so weird because this is a woman I had been so frightened of, and here she was like smiling and talking and not at all like my fantasy, and this had been from the girl. So that's an example where I was temporarily harmed to the point of like a panic, almost a panic attack. But if you either can realize it yourself or talk with colleagues, it's very important to have trusted colleagues that you can trust and you're not ashamed to talk about these weird feelings with. So this happens, and we call it, sometimes you don't catch it and it can go on for a while, and we call that an enactment. And that's when the feelings you have about the patient and the feelings the patient has about you get some trauma, and both of you get triggered, and there can be an embroilment and a agitation going on until you can understand what's happening and step back and gain perspective and then discuss it with the patient. And that usually is a very big step forward if you can do that. Mm-hmm. So these things do happen, but they're not common with me. That happens once in a while. Most of the time, I am able to be involved with the patient and step back and gain perspective. That's empathy. Empathy isn't just feeling for the other person, because then you get lost in them. It's feeling for the other person, but stepping back and understanding what's going on. And that's, we call that dual consciousness, because you're always aware of yourself as separate as well as yourself as mingled with the patient.
Mm-hmm. That's wow, that's fascinating. Actually, Jung talks about how to be a true clinician is to almost enter the fires, and you never come out of it really unharmed. There's always a part of you that in some way is affected by the work you do, because it's really risky business working with the psyches of people.
Yeah, that would be a good title for a book about therapy, Risky Business.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you can get swallowed up. You can get, especially earlier in your career, because earlier in your career, the young clinician is not aware of the importance of perspective taking, of then stepping back and regaining yourself.
And how does one do that?
I'm not sure how to explain it, but you feel for the person, and you sense them, and you understand, and you feel what they're going through, but you also step back and look at it like with a bird's eye view, so that you understand, what's happening, how they feel, but it's a more boundaried position. And that helps the clinician not get lost in the other person.
Yeah. Well, Leanne, I don't want to take too much of your day, but before we finish, I just want to get back to your book a little bit. Imagination, Creativity, Spirituality in Psychotherapy, correct?
Right. Welcome to Wonderland.
Yes, of course. Just to say a few things about it, because personally, I've read it and it really fascinated me. The way it is written and the ideas in it, truly a great read. But for people who haven't read it, can you just talk a bit about what there's in it for people who would read it? Because from reading it, I know it's not just for psychotherapists or people who are interested. For example, I have no background in psychotherapy, but I found it tremendously interesting and useful. But what were your aims, and how do you hope that it can be good for people to read the book?
Well, I want to awaken their creative desire and expand their imagination. And I want them to have the courage to undergo creative tasks, whatever it might be. It could be parenting their child in a creative way. They could be a scientist, and they might want to look at their experiments in a different way. They could be an artist. Whatever they are, I want them to understand the many varieties of imagination they possess and how they can access them to do something new, to move things forward. They could help their community in creative ways. They can help their family, their friends. I want them to always be getting new ideas to inspire them. And I think that the book can teach you how to get new ideas, because that's what refreshes people, and that's what gives their life meaning. And I really feel that the imagination provides access to meaning, which is what everyone wants. Everyone wants their lives to be meaningful, and they want to be meaningful to other people. I can give you a really silly example.
Yeah.
Myself. This is silly, but years ago, sort of like you mentioned your mother, years ago, I used to sew when I was in my 20s. And I just got an idea, partly inspired by my daughter, whom I taught to sew, who now has become incredibly good. I decided to start again after all these years. And it's been like a challenge because it's hard. I have forgotten everything, and there are all kinds of new techniques that I didn't know about. And now I've decided to start making clothes for all my friends. And so I'm involved in, through the long, dark winter of COVID, and I'm living in the country right now instead of in New York City where I normally live. So that it's gets dark very early, and it's going to be a long winter. And I'm having so much fun making clothes for everyone. And we're having a book party for my book, which, by the way, I'll invite you to. And I'm making I'm making something for each of the participants. They're panelists and a moderator, and I'm going to make clothes for everybody, almost like costumes for the party. And this is just a silly thing, but I'm having so much fun. And I think that just comes from being relaxed, and you get ideas. You get ideas about what you can do. And that's just, a very simple idea, but it's giving me a lot of fun.
Interesting. And again, there's this idea to returning to something which you did earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah, reclaiming it.
Reclaiming it, yes. And it's very engrossing. And this is another interesting idea that was one of my favorite ideas. The idea of optimal frustration. That this is what everybody needs. Like if you're a parent with your child, you have to frustrate them in an optimal way, meaning you have to give them you have to require something that is hard for them, but not impossible. So when they accomplish it, they feel really good about themselves. Mm-hmm. And for me, sewing is optimal frustration because it is very hard. And some of the patterns are pretty complicated. But if you spend enough time with it, the ideas come to you, you figure out how to do it. And what I have to do is I have to look at the instructions and think about them for a day or two. And then I understand what they are. So this is like, it's not so frustrating that it's impossible, but it's frustrating in an optimal way.
That's beautiful. It's really a process for you. It's always so nice to hear somebody being really engaged in something. It's really great. And before we close, are there any other upcoming projects you would like to tell people about?
Well, you mentioned Terry Marks Tarlow. She and I are involved in a wonderful collaboration, which is half done, which is a graphic novel about how to heal from trauma and how to work with your dreams to heal from trauma. And it's beautifully illustrated by her. And I think it's an entertaining story, but I think can help people. And I think, my feeling is everyone has had trauma, everyone. So this could appeal to everyone.